Welcome to this segment on Perspectives in the Gospel of John. I'm your tour guide, Ray Crafton. In this segment, we'll look at the story of the woman accused of adultery. This story begins in the final verse of chapter 7, and it occupies the first 11 verses of chapter 8. Depending on what translation you're reading, these verses may or may not be in the body of the text. You may find them in a footnote. If so, note how your copy of chapter 7 ends with verse 52, while the first verse of chapter 8 is numbered 12. So what's going on here? Shown on this slide is a portion of Papyrus P66, which dates to about the year 200. And it's the earliest copy we have of most of the Gospel of John. It was found in 1952 near Dishna, Egypt. And the portion shown also shows the omission of the story that's in verses 7.53 to 8.11, the story of the woman accused of adultery. If it were in this papyrus, it would have been inserted where that little red star is on the figure. Other early copies of the fourth gospel also omit the story. Yet, the story was known at the time. It's referenced in Christian writings from the early 3rd century in Syria. So all of the evidence we have is that the original text of the Gospel of John did not include this story, and that it was inserted into some copies of John at a later point in time. Note the absence of any chapter headings or verse numbers on the papyrus. These are a Western innovation, and they came much later. The chapter divisions that we use today date to the early 13th century. They were an innovation by Archbishop Stephen Langton. He was the Archbishop of Canterbury and a Bible scholar. The system of versification that we use today dates back to 1551, and it was developed by the French printer and Bible scholar Robert Etienne. Not only has this story sometimes been inserted into the Gospel of John, on other rare instances, it's even been inserted into copies of the Gospel of Luke. And when inserted there, it follows verses 37 and 38 in Luke chapter 21. On this slide, you can see how the preface to the story, when it's inserted in John, is very similar to what we read in Luke 21, 37, and 38. In fact, it's been observed that, taken as a whole, the story of the woman accused of adultery sounds more like material that was part of Luke's gospel. The language and the storytelling is more like what you see in Luke than it is what you see in the Gospel of John. So why would an editor add this story to the fourth gospel? What purpose does it accomplish? Well, I can give you 3 rationales for that. The first being that it illustrates in actions what the gospel has been saying in words about the judgment of Jesus, the Son of Man. Earlier in the gospel, there have been words about the Son of Man's authority to judge, and also about how the Son of Man will go about judging. And as I said at the outset of this series, the Gospels want to teach not just by heaping up words, which are processed with the left brain. They teach through images, which are processed on the right side of the brain, and in so doing, completely engage the reader and completely engage the reader's heart as well as the reader's mind. So that's the first rationale. It's a picture. It's a cinematic clip, if you will, of the Son of Man in action. Rationale number 2. It echoes the story of Susanna, and it connects Jesus to Daniel, who dreamed of the Son of Man. When the book of Daniel was translated into Greek, or let's say after it was translated into Greek, a 13th chapter was added, and that's the story of Susanna. So it's not viewed as a part of the Hebrew scriptures, it's a part of the Apocrypha. But it's a very powerful story. It's as fresh and current as the hashtag #MeToo movement. Because in the story of Susanna, two elders of Israel falsely accuse a woman of adultery. And it's because she's spurned their sexual advances. And Daniel figures in this story in a crucial way. He's a young man, but he's the one in the crowd who says, hey, wait a minute, these guys are lying, and I can prove it. And the elders pull him into their circle and say, you're a young fellow, but you seem to have your head on straight. Go ahead and examine them. What's the process? And so Daniel examines the two elders separately. Their testimony does not agree. They're caught in their lie, and they're put to death as a result, whereas the woman falsely accused is freed. So obvious parallels to this story that becomes an insert in the Gospel of John. So Jesus does here exactly, almost exactly what Daniel does in the story of Susanna. And this not only connects Jesus with Daniel, but remember that it's also in the book of Daniel in chapter 7, which is in the Hebrew scriptures. That's where we get the image of the apocalyptic figure of the Son of Man. As I watched in the night visions, writes Daniel, I saw one like a human being coming with the clouds of heaven, and he came to the Ancient One and was presented before him, and so on. So rationale number 2 is all about Jesus as the Son of Man, the apocalyptic judge who, when he judges, the dead will come out of their tombs and be raised to everlasting life or everlasting shame. Finally, there's a third rationale in play here, I think. It shows Jesus defeating an attempted trap. So what is this trap that's being laid for Jesus in this insert into John chapter 8? In many ways, it resembles another story about another trap laid for Jesus. This is the one that's in all 3 of the synoptic gospels, and it's so well known it even finds its way into the scraps we have of something called the Edgerton Gospel, and into a gospel that isn't in the New Testament canon, the Gospel of Thomas. And I'm sure you remember the story. The Jewish leadership comes to Jesus and says, is it legal to pay taxes to Caesar or not? And it's a damned if you do, damned if you don't kind of a story. If Jesus says it's legal, then they run off to Jesus' followers. The leadership runs off to Jesus' followers and lets them know that Jesus is a collaborator, a Roman flunky. He can't possibly be the Messiah. If Jesus says it's not legal to pay taxes, then the Jewish leadership runs off to Pontius Pilate, and they let Pilate know that he's got a rebel on his hands. So damned if you do, damned if you don't. Here's how the trap works in John chapter 8. And it's based on the idea that apparently by the year 30 of the Common Era, the Romans had preempted the trial and punishment of capital cases. The Jews could no longer carry those out themselves. They had to be carried out by the Romans. And a huge piece of evidence in favor of that view is just look at what happened to Jesus. Accused of violating the Mosaic law, accused of blasphemy, and so on. Those are capital offenses. The Mosaic law prescribes stoning. But Jesus wasn't stoned to death. He was executed Roman style in a crucifixion. So that's why the Jewish leadership had to go to Pilate and lean on him until they finally got him to relent and assent and carry out an execution of Jesus. All right, so that's the setup. So here the Jewish leadership comes to Jesus, and the problem here is if Jesus orders the woman's release, he breaks the Mosaic law because they've caught this woman in adultery. If he orders her stoning, which is what the Mosaic law prescribes, then he breaks Roman law. And of course, these people who have come to Jesus are standing there literally with rocks in their hands, waiting to stone this woman so that they can create the pretext of violation of the Roman law. Well, there's a third option, which sounds like a reasonable one at first blush, and that's if, suppose Jesus does the legal right thing here, right in the worldly sense, and recommends that the woman's case be referred to the Roman prefect, which is what Rome expected. It's what the Jews had agreed to. Well, then he kills his credibility with the masses, because here's where the Jewish leadership runs off to Jesus' followers and let them know he can't possibly be the Messiah because he's just a Roman flunky. And so Jesus escapes the trap by being very clever and saying, okay, let's go for the stoning. Who's going to throw the first one? Obviously, you're without sin. And no one's willing to do that. It's they realize that it's a gotcha. And so the story wraps with an illustration of how the Son of Man judges, in which case, in this instance, he says, where are your accusers? They're not here. I'm not accusing you. Think back to what's been said earlier in the gospel about not coming to judge the world, but to save the world. And the instructions to the woman are go and sin no more. Perhaps it seems strange in the story where Jesus writes on the ground in verses 6 and 8. And to understand that, it's worth remembering that the fourth gospel has an overarching theme of being the new Torah of divine love. Thus far in our reading, we've seen this gospel refer in very powerful ways to imagery from Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. In other words, to all 5 books of the Pentateuch, of the Torah. And here in this story, we have Jesus doing something that Yahweh does in Exodus 31. In Exodus 31, Yahweh writes the 10 Commandments, the Decalogue, with his finger. And when Exodus was translated from the Hebrew into Greek, that passage is described, that writing is described using not one but 2 Greek verbs for writing. One is katagrapho and the other is grapho. And John 8, verses 6 and 8, has that same unusual pairing of katagrapho and grapho. And of course, Jesus is writing with his finger. So it's harking back to Exodus 31 and the writing of the law. Further, the first writing, the one that uses the Greek verb katagrapho, that's the word that's used when an accusation or a curse is written. And so Jesus is writing into the ground a curse on this woman's accusers. And that in turn is a reference to Jeremiah 17. O Lord, the hope of Israel, all who forsake thee shall be put to shame. Those who turn away from thee shall be written in the earth, for they have forsaken the Lord, the fountain of living water. And I've underlined not only written in the earth, but also the fountain of living water because let's remember where this scene is and when this scene is. We're still at Jerusalem, and it's still Sukkot. And you recall that Sukkot has as a major theme water. And Jesus has preached in the temple just ahead of this about being the fountain of living water. So katagrapho is the word that's used when an accusation is written. And in this case, it's a curse, as in Jeremiah 17. The second writing, the more usual word for to write, grapho, harks back to or refers to a Roman practice. When a Roman judge was about to give a verdict, he first wrote the verdict and then read it. And so the second writing, grapho, is per Roman practice. Jesus writes the woman's acquittal. That's it for this installment. I believe those of you taking the Bible Challenge will be reading the remainder of chapter 8 next week, so I will take that up in the next presentation. In the meantime, stay safe and peace be with you.